Batman's most mysterious cases explained. Introduction. Gotham City never really sleeps. It only grows quieter. After midnight, the traffic thins. The neon signs keep burning over empty sidewalks, and the fog that rolls in off the bay settles low across the rooftops, the way it has for 100 years. Most people are asleep by then, or trying to be. But somewhere above the streets, moving without sound between the gargoyles and the water towers, there is someone who is not asleep at all. Batman is often described as a superhero, and in the broadest sense that is true. He has fought monsters, gods, aliens, and men who should not, by any reasonable account, still be alive. But underneath the cape and the mythology, Bruce Wayne built something much simpler and in its own way much stranger. He built himself into a detective. Not a detective in the loose, cinematic sense of the word, but a working one in the old tradition, the kind who reads a room the way other people read a sentence, who notices the detail that does not belong before he understands why it matters. Gotham has given him plenty to work with. Most of the crimes that pass through the city are simple enough. A robbery, a shooting, the ordinary, tragic machinery of a city that has never quite gotten used to taking care of itself. Batman deals with those too, more often than the stories tend to show, because they are not the ones worth telling twice. What is worth telling are the cases that refuse to make sense. The ones where the evidence pointed in two directions at once, or in no direction at all. The ones where the criminal was not who he seemed to be, or was someone Batman thought he already knew. The ones that made him question whether he understood the case at all, right up until the last piece slid into place. This is a collection of those cases. Some of them are murders with no obvious suspect. Some are men and women who disappeared from locked, watched rooms. Some involve villains whose crimes never quite added up the way the newspapers assumed they did. A few of them brush up against something that looks, at least for a while, like it might not be explainable at all, which is its own kind of unsettling in a city that Batman has spent his whole life trying to explain. You do not need to have read every comic to follow along. Each case stands on its own, though some of them will circle back to people and places you will come to recognize as the night goes on. All you need to do is settle in, let your eyes close if they want to, and follow Batman through Gotham's strangest nights. The first one begins, in a sense, where Batman himself began. Part 1. Strange Cases in Gotham. Long before Batman had a rogues gallery, before there was a Joker or a Riddler or a Court of Owls, there was simply a man in a strange costume, encountered by Gotham's police with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant gratitude, trying to prove that a costume did not make him any less of a detective. His very first recorded case remains one of the cleanest examples of exactly that kind of proof. It began at the home of a chemical manufacturer named Lambert, a wealthy man who had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy, and who, not long afterward, was found dead in his study. On the surface, it looked almost too simple. Lambert had died from what appeared to be poison in a locked room during a business meeting with two partners who both insisted they had seen nothing unusual. His daughter had called the family friend, Bruce Wayne, in a panic, unaware that Bruce had another way of looking into matters like this one. The police were prepared to write it off as a suicide, or at best an accident brought on by the strain of business troubles. Commissioner Gordon, still new enough to Gotham's peculiar nightlife that he had not yet decided what to make of the man now calling himself the Batman, was willing to let the case close quietly. But something about it bothered him enough that he allowed an unusual visitor into the investigation, a figure who moved through the crime scene with a stillness that made the uniformed officers uneasy, examining a coffee cup, a half-burned letter, and the particular angle at which Lambert's body had fallen. What that visitor noticed was small enough that everyone else had missed it. The poison used was unusual, a specific chemical compound that only a handful of manufacturers produced, and one of the two business partners in the room that night worked directly with that chemical every day. It was not proof by itself, but it was a thread, and threads in this line of work are usually enough to start pulling. Confronted quietly, away from the police, the partner's composure did not hold for long. He had been the one negotiating to buy Lambert's company out from under him, and the meeting that night had been his last chance to do it before the deal collapsed. Rather than lose everything, he had made sure Lambert would not be there to stop him. It was, in the end, an ordinary motive: money and the fear of losing it. What made the case worth remembering was not the crime itself, but the method of solving it, a method that had nothing to do with brute strength or intimidation, and everything to do with patience, chemistry, and the willingness to look at a room longer than anyone else was willing to. Gordon did not say much about it publicly. He did not need to. It was the first small proof of something Gotham would spend the next several decades relearning, again and again, whenever a case seemed too strange or too locked down for anyone else to solve. That the man in the mask was, before anything else, someone who paid attention. Years later, Batman would encounter another case that tested that same skill in an entirely different way, because this time the puzzle was not a body in a locked room. It was a man who claimed he no longer wanted to be a criminal at all, and Batman had no way of knowing whether to believe him. Edward Nigel, who the newspapers and the underworld alike knew better as the Riddler, had spent years building a reputation as one of Gotham's strangest and most exhausting criminals, a man who could not commit a robbery without first mailing a clue to the police, because, for the Riddler, being caught was almost beside the point. What mattered to him was being clever enough that he deserved to get away with it, and there had always been a strange, brittle pride underneath his crimes, as if some part of him wanted an audience smart enough to appreciate the puzzle. Then, without warning, he stopped. The Riddler announced, through legitimate channels this time, that he had given up crime entirely. He had taken a respectable identity, opened a private investigation business, and even begun cooperating in small ways, with cases the police found themselves unable to crack. To Gotham, it read as either a genuine reform or an elaborate joke, and Batman, who had learned a long time ago not to take either possibility for granted, chose to watch rather than assume. What made the situation difficult was that Nigel was, by every visible measure, doing exactly what a reformed man would do. He solved a few minor cases competently. He avoided any hint of criminal behavior. He even seemed, in his public appearances, oddly sincere, a man who had grown tired of losing to Batman again and again, and had decided, in his own roundabout way, that outsmarting the law from the other side might be more satisfying than breaking it. Batman followed him for weeks without finding a single thread to pull, and that absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, because a man as compulsively clever as Nigel did not simply stop being clever. He redirected it. The truth came out slowly, and only because Batman refused to stop watching after everyone else had decided the case was closed. Nigel had not reformed so much as changed the shape of his ambition. His new detective business was, in practice, a way of studying crimes up close, learning how investigators thought, and occasionally steering cases toward conclusions that quietly benefited him, all while wearing the appearance of a man who had turned his life around. It was, in its own way, the most Riddler-like crime he had ever committed, a puzzle built entirely out of his own reputation, daring Batman to prove that a man who looked innocent on every visible level was still, underneath it, exactly who he had always been. When Batman finally confronted him with proof, quietly and without theatrics, Nigel did not seem angry. If anything, he seemed almost pleased, the way a puzzle designer might be pleased to learn that someone had actually finished the puzzle instead of giving up. It was, Batman would later note, one of the clearer illustrations of a lesson Gotham kept teaching him in different forms. That in a city full of brilliant, damaged people, the absence of a crime was sometimes the most suspicious thing of all. Not every mystery in Gotham involved a body or a criminal trying to disappear into a new identity. Some of the strangest cases began with something far smaller, an object, a rumor, or a single unexplained detail that refused to fit anywhere else. And it was often those smaller cases that revealed the most about the kind of city Gotham truly was. Among the very earliest cases in Batman's career was one built entirely around a false assumption he did not correct quickly enough. A string of jewel thefts aboard a luxury ocean liner were attributed to a mysterious figure the newspapers had already nicknamed the Cat, and the trail Batman followed initially led him to an elderly widow traveling among the ship's other wealthy passengers, a woman who seemed, on the surface, like an unlikely and almost sympathetic suspect. The true thief revealed herself only once cornered, peeling away a disguise convincing enough that Batman had walked directly past her more than once without recognizing the deception. A striking young woman named Selina Kyle, who had built the entire persona specifically because an elderly, unthreatening appearance drew far less scrutiny than her own. It was, in its own small way, an early lesson in a pattern that would recur throughout Batman's career, that Gotham's cleverest criminals rarely looked the part, and that the correct question in any investigation was never simply who seemed suspicious, but who had the most reason to make sure they didn't. A different, more personal kind of case involved a criminal who never touched Batman directly at all, and yet managed, for a long stretch of time, to control the timing of an entire investigation from inside a prison cell. Julian Day, known to Gotham as Calendar Man, had built his entire criminal identity around the significance of dates, timing his own crimes to holidays and anniversaries with an obsessive precision that made his early career feel more like performance art than genuine threat. What made him worth remembering, however, was not his own crimes, most of which were relatively minor, but the role he began playing later, from behind bars, as a kind of unwilling oracle for other investigations. Batman, and later Harvey Dent during his own tenure as district attorney, found that Calendar Man's obsessive knowledge of significant dates occasionally made him useful for narrowing down when an unrelated crime was likely to occur, provided anyone could stand to sit across from him long enough to get a straight answer. Day enjoyed the attention enormously, doling out real information wrapped in riddles and delays purely for the pleasure of being needed. And Batman learned, case after case, that the most efficient way through a conversation with him was never to rush, since impatience only made him savor the process longer. It became one of the stranger recurring arrangements in Batman's career, an ongoing, low-grade negotiation with a man who had almost no capacity to commit serious crime on his own, but an almost unmatched understanding of when other Gotham criminals liked to strike, and a personality that made every piece of that knowledge feel like it had to be earned through patience rather than pressure. One of the stranger patterns Batman noticed, early in his career, was that Gotham's confessions could not always be trusted. In a city with an ordinary crime rate, a confession usually closes a case. In Gotham, more than once, people walked into police stations insisting they had committed murders they had no memory of, describing details that did not match the actual crime scene, certain of their own guilt in a way that unsettled even the officers taking their statements. Batman eventually traced the pattern back to Jonathan Crane, the criminal known as the Scarecrow, whose fear toxin did more than terrify its victims. In high enough doses, and under the right conditions, it could distort memory itself, convincing a frightened mind that it had done something terrible simply because the fear felt real enough to seem like guilt. More than one Gotham investigation nearly ended with an innocent person behind bars before Batman untangled the difference between a memory and a nightmare planted by chemistry. It became one of the quiet, recurring lessons of working in this city, that even a confession, freely given, was not always evidence of the truth. Not every mystery in Gotham stayed confined to a single crime scene or a single suspect, however. Some of the cases that troubled Batman most were the ones where he could not be entirely certain, until the very end, whether he was chasing a criminal or being led by one. Part 2. The cases that made Batman question what he knew. There is a particular kind of case that unsettles even an experienced detective more than a simple murder does, and that is the case built entirely on misdirection, where every clue seems to point somewhere true and turns out, eventually, to have been placed there on purpose. Batman encountered several of these over the years, but few unsettled him as thoroughly as the period in which Dr. Hugo Strange came closer than almost anyone else ever had to becoming him. Hugo Strange was, before almost anything else, a psychiatrist and a brilliant one, which made him more dangerous than most of Gotham's costumed criminals rather than less. Where other villains wanted money or chaos, Strange wanted understanding, specifically the understanding of exactly who was operating underneath the mask of the Batman. He pursued that question with the patience of an academic rather than the impatience of a criminal, studying patterns, injuries, and the subtle physical similarities between Batman and the city's reclusive billionaire, Bruce Wayne, until the evidence became, in his own mind, undeniable. What made this case so dangerous was not that Strange guessed correctly. Plenty of brilliant people had guessed correctly over the years and been talked out of it, misdirected, or simply disbelieved. What made it dangerous was that Strange did not stop at guessing. He built a body double, studied Bruce Wayne's mannerisms with obsessive precision, and began quietly inserting himself into Bruce's life, close enough to gather proof and, eventually, close enough to attempt something far more audacious, taking Bruce Wayne's identity for himself, appearing at public functions as Bruce while keeping the real one drugged and imprisoned, and even attempting to become Batman in Gotham's eyes by adopting the costume outright. For a period of time, the people closest to Bruce Wayne were, in effect, living alongside an imposter without realizing it. That is the detail that makes the case worth remembering. It was not solved through a dramatic confrontation so much as through the accumulation of small wrongnesses, tiny behavioral details that did not match, until the people who knew Bruce best began to sense that something about him had changed, even before they could say exactly what. Batman, once free, did not simply overpower Strange. He had to first prove, methodically and with evidence Strange could not talk his way around, that the man walking around Gotham in his name was not who he claimed to be. Part of what made the eventual resolution possible was Alfred Pennyworth's own quiet, persistent unease, a sense that something about the man attending Wayne Manor functions was subtly wrong that he could not initially justify to anyone else with hard evidence. Alfred began keeping his own small, private notes, comparing the imposter's habits against decades of genuine familiarity with Bruce's actual behavior. And it was this accumulated record, more than any single dramatic clue, that eventually gave Batman enough of a foundation to confirm what had happened and determine where Strange was actually holding the real Bruce Wayne. It stands as one of the clearer examples in Batman's history of a case, solved less through detective brilliance in the moment, and more through the patient, unglamorous discipline of someone who simply refused to accept that a familiar face was reason enough to stop paying attention. It remains one of the few cases in Batman's history where the criminal's true goal was never money or revenge, but identity itself, and where losing the case would not have meant a robbery going unsolved. It would have meant Bruce Wayne quietly disappearing from his own life. A quieter but equally unsettling case of infiltration involved a criminal calling himself Prometheus, who had spent years methodically studying the training methods, psychological profiles, and operational habits of the world's most capable heroes, Batman included, before ever committing a single crime that drew their attention. By the time Batman and his allies recognized him as a genuine threat, Prometheus had already gathered enough information to anticipate their standard responses with disturbing accuracy, having essentially reverse-engineered years of hard-won investigative technique simply by observing patterns from a careful distance. The most unnerving discovery in the case was not Prometheus's combat training, considerable as it was, but the fact that his research had, at one point, granted him at least partial access to information about the Batcave's own systems, a breach that forced Batman to reconsider just how much of his supposedly secure operation had actually been exposed without his knowledge. Resolving the case required not just stopping Prometheus directly, but auditing an enormous amount of Batman's own infrastructure to determine exactly how deep the intrusion had gone, a process that took considerably longer than the initial physical confrontation itself, and left Batman with a lasting, healthy suspicion that his own methods, however effective, were never entirely unstudyable by someone patient enough to try. The audit itself uncovered something Batman found almost more troubling than the breach. Several redundant safeguards he had built into his own systems years earlier, specifically to catch exactly this kind of intrusion, had gone untriggered, either because Prometheus's methods had genuinely outpaced them, or because Batman himself had grown slightly too confident in defenses he had not meaningfully tested in a long while. He rebuilt those systems considerably more aggressively afterward, treating the experience less as a single closed case and more as a standing reminder that any defense left unchallenged for long enough eventually stops being a defense at all and simply becomes an assumption. A far stranger case unfolded when Batman himself was forced out of the role entirely, after his spine was broken in a prolonged campaign waged by a criminal called Bane, and Gotham was left to be protected by someone wearing the same symbol without being the same man underneath it. What made Bane's campaign so effective, and so difficult for Batman to see coming until it was nearly too late, was the year Bane had spent beforehand simply studying him, engineering the escape of nearly every significant inmate from Arkham Asylum at once, and then watching, patiently, as Batman exhausted himself capturing them one by one, learning his habits, his stamina, and his breaking points in exhaustive detail before ever appearing to fight him directly. By the time the two finally confronted each other, Bane already understood Batman's methods more thoroughly than almost any opponent he had faced, precisely because Bane had never once tried to outfight him. He had simply outweighted him, treating the entire ordeal as a long, patient investigation of his own, aimed not at solving a mystery, but at manufacturing the exact conditions under which Batman would already be too depleted to properly defend himself. Jean-Paul Valley had been trained since childhood by a secretive religious order called the Sacred Order of Saint Dumas, conditioned through a program known only as the system to become an efficient, obedient weapon whenever his training was activated. Bruce Wayne, recovering and unable to fulfill his duties, selected Jean-Paul as a temporary replacement, unaware of exactly how deeply the system's conditioning still ran beneath his conscious control. For a period of time, Gotham's criminals and Gotham's citizens were dealing with a Batman who looked the part convincingly enough, while growing steadily more violent, more paranoid, and more willing to cross lines the real Batman had spent a lifetime refusing to cross. The unsettling part of the case, for those closest to the situation, was how gradual the change was. Jean-Paul did not announce a shift in values. He simply began making slightly harsher decisions, tolerating slightly more collateral damage, escalating slightly further with each confrontation. Changes small enough individually to explain away as the stress of an unfamiliar role, but substantial enough in some that Gotham was, by the time anyone fully recognized what was happening, being protected by someone considerably more dangerous than the man they thought they had lost. Bruce Wayne's eventual return to the role required not just physical recovery, but a direct, forceful confrontation with someone wearing his own symbol. One of the very few times Batman has had to reclaim his own identity from someone who had never actually stolen it, only borrowed it and slowly, unknowingly, become something else while wearing it. A different kind of deception troubled Batman years later, one built not around a single imposter, but around a name that seemed to belong to everyone and no one at once. The name was Hush, and for a long stretch of time, Batman was not entirely certain the person behind it existed as a single individual at all. It began with a series of crimes that seemed, individually, unconnected. Villains Batman had fought for years suddenly appeared with new resources, better information, and in several cases, knowledge of details about Batman's life that they should never have had access to. The Riddler seemed to know things he had no way of learning on his own. Old wounds, old relationships, and old grief all resurfaced at precisely the moments most likely to cause Batman pain, as though someone was reading his life like a case file and deciding, deliberately, which chapters to reopen. The investigation was unusually personal, because the trail eventually led back to Bruce Wayne's own childhood, and to a friend he had not thought about in years. Thomas Elliot, a brilliant surgeon who had grown up alongside Bruce, and whose resentment of the Wayne family, it turned out, had never fully gone away. Elliot had built an elaborate persona for himself, wrapped in bandages, giving nothing away about his identity, orchestrating an extended campaign that used Batman's own rogues gallery as instruments in a much larger plan, aimed specifically at Bruce Wayne. What made this case difficult was not identifying a single culprit, but understanding how much damage a person can do simply by knowing someone else's life in intimate detail and choosing, with surgical precision, exactly where to apply pressure. Batman had faced enemies who wanted to hurt him physically many times before. Hush was among the first to understand that a well-placed piece of information could hurt far more than a well-placed punch, and that a mystery does not always need a hidden face to be dangerous. Sometimes it only needs a familiar one, worn by someone Batman had once trusted completely. The investigation itself unfolded almost like an archaeology project as much as a criminal one, with Batman forced to revisit relationships and old case files he had assumed were long settled, checking each one for the same subtle fingerprints of manipulation he had found in the others. Catwoman, briefly and painfully suspected of being complicit in the scheme herself, was eventually cleared, though not before the accusation strained a relationship that had already been complicated enough without outside interference. By the time Elliot was finally identified with certainty, the case had touched nearly every major relationship in Bruce Wayne's life in some way, a reminder that the most effective way to hurt someone thoroughly is rarely a single decisive blow. but a long, patient campaign aimed at everything they care about at once. A subtler version of the same problem arrived whenever Gotham's criminals learned to exploit the shape-shifting abilities of Basil Carlo, and later Matt Hagen, both of whom would, at different points, take up the name Clayface, and both of whom shared an ability that made ordinary detective work briefly unreliable: the power to reshape their own features into a near-perfect likeness of anyone they chose. For a city that relied heavily on eyewitness identification, this created a specific, recurring problem. More than once, Gotham's police, and occasionally Batman himself, found themselves questioning a suspect who appeared, by every visual and even some physical measures, to be someone else entirely. A respected businessman, a police officer, on one especially unsettling occasion, someone close to Bruce Wayne's own social circle. The crimes committed while wearing these borrowed faces ranged from simple theft to far more serious offenses, and in each case, the initial investigation inevitably pointed toward the wrong person entirely, since the wrong person was, as far as any witness could tell, exactly who had been seen at the scene. What eventually made these cases solvable was not a change in method so much as a change in assumption. Batman learned, after being fooled more than once, to treat perfect eyewitness identification in Gotham with the same suspicion he applied to a suspiciously convenient confession, checking for the subtler details a shape-shifted impersonation could not quite replicate. A texture slightly too smooth, a temperature slightly too cool to the touch, a scent chemistry could not fully disguise. It became one of the quieter lessons Gotham forced on him, that in a city where a face was not always proof of an identity, the only truly reliable evidence was the kind that a disguise, however advanced, could not think to fake. Those cases were unsettling because they blurred the line between enemy and imposter. But Gotham's rogues gallery had produced far stranger threats than deception alone, and some of them were strange not because of what they hid, but because of what they simply were. Part 3: Batman's Strangest Enemies. Every city with enough crime eventually produces criminals who specialize, and Gotham, more than most places, tended to produce specialists whose obsessions doubled as riddles in their own right. Few illustrate that better than the extended, unresolved mystery surrounding a killer who called himself Holiday. It began during Harvey Dent's final year as Gotham's district attorney, before the acid that would eventually split his face and his mind in two ever touched him. Gotham's underworld was already unraveling under the combined pressure of Dent's prosecutions, Commissioner Gordon's investigations, and Batman's nightly patrols when a series of murders began, always timed to a holiday on the calendar, always claimed by someone signing letters only as Holiday. Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day. Each murder targeted someone connected to organized crime, and each one left behind almost no physical evidence beyond the timing itself. The obvious suspects multiplied instead of narrowing. Nearly everyone close to the investigation had a plausible reason to want Gotham's crime families destroyed, and nearly everyone had at least one unaccounted-for evening on the relevant dates. Batman, Gordon, and Dent worked the case together for the better part of a year, watching the city's criminal organizations collapse in on themselves under the pressure of a killer they could not identify and therefore could not stop through ordinary means. It became, in a very real sense, the case that broke Harvey Dent, not because he failed to solve it, but because of what solving pieces of it and failing to solve the rest eventually cost him. By the time Dent's own transformation into Two-Face occurred, the full truth of who had committed every Holiday murder had still not been cleanly resolved, and the case remains, even now, one that Batman revisits with more reflection than certainty, aware that some of Gotham's ugliest years were shaped by a killer whose identity was never entirely settled beyond doubt. A slower, sadder mystery surrounded Waylon Jones, a man born with a rare condition that gave his skin a rough, scaled texture, and earned him the cruel nickname Killer Croc long before he had committed any crime at all. Rejected and mocked for most of his life because of his appearance, Jones eventually turned to crime, and Batman's early encounters with him treated him as a fairly conventional physical threat, an unusually strong opponent to be subdued rather than a genuine mystery. The mystery, such as it was, developed gradually, and concerned a question Batman found himself less and less able to answer with confidence as the years passed. Whether Jones's condition was slowly, physically changing not just his appearance but his mind, pulling him further from ordinary human thought the longer it progressed. Certain encounters left him behaving in ways that seemed less calculated and more instinctive than before, and medical consultations Batman arranged, discreetly, over the years never fully settled whether this reflected a genuine physiological regression or simply the accumulated psychological toll of a lifetime spent being treated as something less than human. Batman never resolved the question to his own satisfaction, and it left him handling Jones with a degree of caution that had less to do with physical danger than with an uncomfortable uncertainty about how much of the man originally born Waylon Jones still remained reachable underneath everything Gotham and his own body had done to him since. Another pattern of seemingly voluntary, self-destructive behavior among Gotham's wealthy led Batman to Pamela Eiley, a brilliant botanist whose exposure to experimental plant toxins had left her able to produce pheromones capable of inducing intense infatuation and suggestibility in anyone who breathed them in. Calling herself Poison Ivy, she used that ability to convince a string of Gotham's philanthropists and business leaders to sign over enormous sums of money and property, each of them insisting afterward with complete sincerity that they had simply fallen in love and wanted to help her. From a legal standpoint, the cases were maddening, since every so-called victim was prepared to testify that the transfer of their fortune had been entirely their own idea. Batman's investigation had to establish, through toxicology and behavioral evidence rather than testimony, that consent obtained through direct chemical manipulation of someone's mind could not reasonably be called consent at all, a legal and ethical argument that Gotham's courts were not always eager to accept, particularly when the victims themselves refused to see it that way. What made the case worth remembering was less the crime itself than the discomfort it exposed in how a city defines free will, forcing Batman, Gordon, and eventually a reluctant judge to reckon with the uncomfortable possibility that a person's own certainty about their feelings is not always reliable evidence of anything at all. The case ended, in a sense, with the city's crime families broken and Harvey Dent gone, replaced by a man who flipped a coin before every decision and seemed to genuinely believe the outcome was beyond his own control. Batman's later encounters with Two-Face raised a quieter, more personal question that the original Holiday investigation never had to address: whether the coin flip was ever truly random at all, or whether Harvey's damaged mind was unconsciously weighting the outcome toward whichever decision some deeper, more familiar part of him already wanted to make. On the handful of occasions when Two-Face's coin came up scratched, its two faces suddenly identical rather than one marred and one clean, Batman noticed a marked shift in his behavior: calmer, more calculating, closer in some ways to the district attorney he had once been, before the coin was inevitably restored and the more volatile personality reasserted itself. Whether that shift reflected a genuine second personality asserting temporary control, one still recognizable as the original Harvey Dent underneath the damage, or simply a different emotional register within the same unified, unpredictable man, was never something Batman felt he could answer with full confidence, and he generally chose not to press the question too directly, aware that some of Gotham's oldest friendships survive longer when certain things are left gently unexamined. A stranger, quieter mystery involved a criminal whose most dangerous quality was that no one, including Batman for a long while, could be entirely sure where the man ended and the puppet began. Arnold Wesker was a small, anxious man with a talent for ventriloquism, and by every account from the people who had known him before his criminal career, an almost pathological inability to assert himself. Then Gotham began seeing a new organized crime figure calling himself Scarface, a wooden dummy dressed like an old gangster, giving orders through Wesker's voice while Wesker himself sat beside him, silent, deferential, and apparently terrified of his own puppet. The obvious explanation was theater, a nervous man hiding behind a prop to seem more intimidating. Batman initially treated it that way, and was surprised at how effectively the ruse worked on Gotham's other criminals, who followed Scarface's orders with a seriousness that seemed absurd until it wasn't. The deeper Batman investigated, however, the less certain that explanation became. Wesker, under psychiatric evaluation, insisted with total sincerity that Scarface was the dominant personality, that he was frightened of the dummy, and that he had, at times, no memory of crimes Scarface had ordered while Wesker's own hands carried them out. Whether this represented a severe dissociative condition, a form of self-deception so complete that Wesker had genuinely convinced himself of it, or something in between, no psychiatrist who examined him, including Hugo Strange during one especially unsettling consultation, was ever able to fully resolve. What made the case worth remembering was not the crimes Scarface ordered, which were fairly typical organized crime activity. It was the unanswered question underneath all of it, one Batman found himself returning to more than once: whether Gotham's criminals had spent years taking orders from a man too afraid to admit he was in control, or from something that had, in every meaningful sense that mattered to Wesker, actually become real. A different kind of case, one that puzzled the police far longer than it puzzled Batman, involved a wave of ordinary Gotham citizens committing crimes entirely out of character for them, with no apparent motive, and afterward, almost no memory of having done it at all. A bank teller emptied a vault for no reason he could explain. A city council member cast a vote that contradicted everything he had ever publicly stood for. Each case looked, individually, like a strange personal breakdown. Together, they formed a pattern that eventually led Batman to Jervis Tetch, a mild-mannered former hatmaker who called himself the Mad Hatter, and whose obsession with Lewis Carroll's Alice stories masked a genuinely dangerous talent for neurological engineering. Tetch had developed small mind control devices, disguised as ordinary hat pins and hair clips, capable of overriding a person's free will just long enough to make them carry out a specific instruction before the device's effects faded, leaving its victim with no clear memory of the interval and no obvious explanation for their own actions. Because the devices were so small and so easily discarded, and because the resulting crimes appeared to have no external cause at all, several cases had been closed, incorrectly, as simple personal lapses before Batman noticed the pattern connecting them. The investigation was complicated by the fact that Tetch's victims were, in every meaningful legal sense, innocent, having acted without any conscious will of their own, which left Batman in the unusual position of needing to solve a series of crimes without being able to hold most of the people who had committed them responsible for any of it. The case ended not with a satisfying arrest of an obvious culprit caught in the act, but with a slower, quieter process of tracing small mechanical components back to their source, followed by the far more difficult task of explaining to a string of bewildered, ashamed Gotham citizens that whatever they remembered doing or failing to remember had not really been their fault at all. Villains like these made Batman question not just what had happened in a given case, but whether the person responsible for it could even be held to an ordinary standard of blame. That question would return again and again throughout his career, but rarely as sharply as it did the night Gotham lost one of its own. Part 4: Disappearances, Murders, and Impossible Crimes. Some cases are difficult because the clues are scarce. Others are difficult because there are too many people who might have made the same choice Batman himself would have to live with. The disappearance and presumed death of Jason Todd, the second young man to take up the identity of Robin, belongs to the second category, and it remains one of the most painful and most carefully documented cases in Batman's entire history. Jason had always been a rougher fit for the role than Dick Grayson before him. Where Dick approached crime fighting with discipline inherited from a childhood in the circus, Jason carried an anger that Gotham's streets had put into him long before Batman found him, and that anger occasionally led him toward decisions Batman did not endorse. It was that same restless independence that sent Jason, alone, to Ethiopia, chasing information about the woman he believed to be his birth mother, unaware that the trail had been engineered by the Joker specifically to draw him there. What followed was not a mystery in the sense of an unclear culprit. The Joker's involvement was never in doubt, and the method, an explosion in an abandoned warehouse, was confirmed almost immediately. The true mystery of the case was subtler, and in some ways more difficult for Batman than any locked-room puzzle could have been. Whether Jason could have been saved if the response had been faster, whether Batman himself was too far away when it mattered, and whether some decisions, once made, can ever really be reconstructed cleanly enough to assign a single, satisfying answer to the question of what went wrong. Batman investigated his own failure in that case as rigorously as he investigated any external crime, and never fully closed the file on himself. Years later, an entirely different kind of impossible case tested Batman's ability to solve a crime that seemed to defy the ordinary rules of investigation altogether. Because, for one long, terrible night, an entire section of Gotham lost its lights, its communications, and any reliable way of tracking who was doing what to whom. It happened early in Batman's career, during a period when the Riddler was still a relatively new and unproven threat, eager to prove that his cleverness could outmatch not just the police but Batman himself. Using access he should not have had to the city's infrastructure, the Riddler orchestrated a citywide blackout timed precisely to Gotham's worst storm in years. And in the darkness and confusion that followed, ordinary crime accelerated into something closer to a citywide crime spree, with looting, arson, and violence breaking out faster than the police, working without power or reliable radio contact, could respond to it. The impossible part of the case was not any single crime committed during the blackout. It was the sheer scale of trying to investigate anything at all under those conditions, with witnesses scattered, evidence destroyed by fire and flooding, and no way to reliably establish where anyone had been at any given hour. Batman's solution was not, in the end, a single clever deduction. It was a night spent doing something closer to triage than detection, prioritizing the crimes that could still be stopped over the ones that could only be investigated afterward, and accepting that some of what happened that night would never be fully accounted for. It taught him a lesson he would carry into every blackout, riot, and citywide crisis afterward: that some mysteries are not solved so much as survived, with the accounting done later, and imperfectly, once the immediate danger has passed. A quieter, more procedural kind of impossible crime involved Victor Zass, a serial killer who carved a tally mark into his own skin for every life he claimed. A grim record that Batman and the Gotham City Police Department had come to rely on, uneasily, as one of the few pieces of hard data available whenever Zass was captured or examined. The trouble began when the number of confirmed, attributable murders in a particular string of killings failed to match the number of fresh marks found on his body, leaving open an unsettling question. Had Zass simply lost count in the chaos of his own violence, or was someone else committing murders and allowing them to be blamed on him? Resolving the discrepancy required treating Zass's own body, in a sense, as an unreliable witness, cross-referencing the timing and condition of specific tally marks against verified timelines for each killing, a forensic approach that felt closer to auditing a ledger than investigating a murder. The eventual answer, uncovered only through painstaking timeline reconstruction, confirmed that a copycat had indeed been active during part of the string, deliberately mimicking Zass's method to disguise an entirely separate, personally motivated killing within a pattern everyone already assumed they understood. It remains one of the clearer examples of how even Gotham's most straightforwardly brutal criminals can, without any deception on their own part, end up providing cover for someone else's crime simply by being infamous enough that people stop double-checking the details. Zass himself, once confronted with the discrepancy during a subsequent psychiatric evaluation, reacted with something close to genuine offense at the idea that a lesser killer had used his reputation as camouflage, insisting with disturbing sincerity that every mark on his body represented a life he alone had taken, and that anyone claiming otherwise was cheapening what he considered, in his own deeply disturbed framework, an almost sacred private ritual. It was a strange, uncomfortable reminder that even Gotham's most purely destructive criminals sometimes cared, in their own way, about the accuracy of their own record. A stranger case, and one that unsettled Batman for reasons that had little to do with the actual crimes committed, involved a criminal calling himself the Wrath, whose methods seemed to mirror Batman's own so precisely that for a while, the investigation felt less like chasing an unknown suspect and more like chasing a distorted reflection of himself. The Wrath, it turned out, had lived a childhood almost perfectly inverted from Bruce Wayne's own. His parents had been career criminals, killed by the same police officer whose partner had, years earlier, been present the night the Waynes were murdered. Rather than channeling that loss into justice, the Wrath had trained himself in secret to become an efficient killer targeting police officers specifically, treating his own parents' deaths as the origin story for a mission that was, in almost every structural sense, Batman's own story told in reverse. What made the case difficult to investigate in the ordinary way was that the Wrath anticipated Batman's methods with uncomfortable accuracy, having apparently studied Batman's known techniques and case history closely enough to plan around them. Batman found himself, for the first time in a long while, having to deliberately act against his own habitual patterns simply to stay unpredictable against an opponent who seemed to have prepared specifically for the detective he expected to be. The case ended in a direct confrontation rather than a slow accumulation of evidence, but it left Batman with a lingering, uneasy awareness that Gotham's tragedies did not always produce someone like him. Sometimes, under only slightly different circumstances, they produced exactly the opposite. What made the aftermath particularly difficult was the discovery of just how closely the Wrath's training regimen had mirrored Batman's own, down to specific combat disciplines and investigative techniques that Batman had assumed were unique enough to his own methods that no one else could have independently arrived at them. It forced an uncomfortable, quieter reassessment afterward, a recognition that his own approach to crime fighting, however carefully developed, was not so singular that a sufficiently determined, sufficiently damaged person could not reconstruct something functionally similar on their own, given the right starting tragedy and enough time alone with their grief. Perhaps the most disorienting case in this category arrived years after Jason's death had already been mourned, investigated, and, as much as such a thing can be, accepted, when evidence began surfacing that suggested he might still be alive. The first signs were small and easy to dismiss: second-hand reports and unconfirmed sightings of someone matching Jason's description operating in Gotham's underworld. Batman, who had spent years assuming that particular file would never reopen, approached the reports with the same caution he would apply to any claim that seemed too painful to be safely hoped for. The truth, when it finally surfaced, involved a chain of events almost as difficult to accept as the possibility itself. Exposure to the restorative waters of a Lazarus pit, the same mysterious, reality-bending source that Ra's al Ghul had relied on for decades to extend his own life, had returned Jason from death, though not entirely intact, his memories and personality altered by the experience in ways that left him angrier, more willing to kill, and deeply resentful of Batman for what Jason viewed as a failure to avenge his death properly. Confirming that this altered, hardened man calling himself Red Hood was genuinely Jason, and not an elaborate deception exploiting Batman's grief, required verifying details only Jason could have known, alongside physical evidence that no impersonation could easily fake. What made the case so difficult, even after Jason's identity was confirmed beyond doubt, was that solving the mystery did not resolve the underlying problem. Batman had spent years processing Jason's death as something closed and permanent, only to be confronted with a version of his former partner who was demonstrably alive, unmistakably real, and fundamentally changed by everything that had happened to him in between. It remains one of the rare cases where identifying the truth left Batman with a more complicated situation than the one he started with, rather than a simpler one. Some of Gotham's strangest cases, however, were not the ones that tested Batman's detective skills directly. They were the ones that tested the people around him, the family he had built out of orphans, runaways, and one very patient butler, each of whom had their own instincts for noticing things Batman sometimes missed. Part 5. The Mysteries of the Bat Family. Long before he ever wore a costume, Tim Drake noticed something that took him only a matter of days to work out, and that had taken most of Gotham years to overlook entirely. That Batman had become noticeably more reckless, more prone to unnecessary risks, in the period since Dick Grayson had stopped working alongside him as Robin. Tim was, at the time, simply an unusually observant boy who had pieced together Batman's true identity through nothing more exotic than careful attention paid at the circus, at galas, and in newspaper photographs, cross-referencing small physical details the way a much older detective might have. What worried him was not the secret itself, but the pattern he noticed once he understood it. Without a partner watching his back and, more importantly, without someone to be responsible for beyond himself, Batman's judgment had begun to slip in small, dangerous ways, taking chances a more careful version of himself would never have taken. Convincing Batman of this was, in its own way, a more delicate investigation than identifying him in the first place. Tim had no interest in simply inserting himself into a role that had already been worn and lost by someone else. He had to make the case, methodically and with evidence, that Batman's current trajectory was unsustainable, gathering examples of near misses and unnecessary risks the way a prosecutor might build a case, before Batman would even seriously entertain the idea of training a third Robin. It remains one of the few mysteries in the collection where the person doing the investigating was, in every meaningful sense, still a child, and where the thing he uncovered was not a criminal at all, but a slow, quiet form of self-destruction in someone he had never even met. A darker version of that same instinct for detection appeared years later, during a period when Dick Grayson himself had taken up the mantle of Batman and found himself investigating a killer whose crimes led disturbingly close to home. Gotham experienced a string of murders targeting corrupt officials and criminals who had, technically, escaped legal punishment for their crimes, each one killed with a precision and a lack of remorse that suggested someone treating the city's failures in law enforcement as a personal project to correct. The evidence, gathered slowly and with mounting reluctance, eventually pointed toward James Gordon Jr., the adult son of Commissioner Gordon, a young man who had spent years cultivating an image of calm, articulate reasonableness that made the conclusion almost impossible for those closest to him to accept. What made the case so difficult for Dick Grayson was not proving what James had done, which the evidence eventually supported clearly enough. It was recognizing, and then having to act on, the realization that James's calm was not innocence but a very well-practiced kind of concealment, the sort that had allowed him to move through his own family's life for years without anyone recognizing what he actually was. Commissioner Gordon, who had spent his career trusting evidence over instinct, was forced in this case to accept a conclusion his instincts had been resisting for years, and Dick Grayson, wearing a cowl that was not originally his, had to deliver news that no detective ever wants to be the one to confirm about someone else's child. One of the more troubling mysteries within Batman's own household involved Alfred Pennyworth himself, during a period when a mysterious, malevolent presence known only as the Outsider began influencing events around Wayne Manor in ways nobody could immediately trace back to a source. Small manipulations, misplaced information, and subtly altered plans began accumulating, each one explainable individually but increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence once patterns emerged. The eventual, deeply unwelcome discovery was that Alfred, exposed years earlier to unusual radiation during an old case, had developed a dormant, split personality entirely unknown to him, one that could seize control of his body and act with intentions completely opposed to everything the ordinary, waking Alfred stood for. Confirming this required Batman to investigate someone he trusted more completely than almost anyone else in his life, cross-referencing the timing of Alfred's own unexplained gaps in memory against the specific incidents that had gone wrong, a process that felt, by Batman's own account, considerably more painful than any external threat could have been. It remains one of the more quietly devastating entries in the Bat family's history, a reminder that the household Batman relied on as his one dependable refuge from Gotham's dangers was not, it turned out, entirely immune to them either. A different kind of ongoing mystery arrived in the form of a 10-year-old boy delivered to Bruce Wayne's doorstep by Talia al Ghul, Ra's al Ghul's daughter, with the announcement that the boy, Damian, was Bruce's biological son, raised in secret within the League of Assassins and trained since infancy to kill without hesitation. The immediate question was straightforward enough to confirm. The far more difficult, ongoing question was how much of Damien's upbringing could realistically be undone, and whether his presence in Gotham represented a genuine reconciliation or simply another maneuver in Talia's long, complicated relationship with Bruce. Damien arrived already fluent in violence and entirely unfamiliar with restraint, treating his early training among Gotham's heroes as a set of unnecessary limitations rather than genuine values. And the Bat family spent a considerable period simply trying to determine how much of his behavior reflected deliberate loyalty to his mother's agenda versus the understandable, if troubling, instincts of a child raised with no other framework to draw from. It was never a case with a single clean resolution. Talia's motives shifted across the years that followed, at times genuinely protective of her son, and at other times willing to use him as leverage against Bruce. And Damien's own loyalties matured slowly, through hard-won experience rather than any single confrontation that settled the matter definitively. What made the situation worth including among Gotham's mysteries was the fact that it never fully resolved into simple trust, even after Damien had spent years fighting alongside his father and earned, by any reasonable measure, a place in the family. Batman continued quietly to watch for signs that Talia's influence might reassert itself, aware that some questions about a person's loyalty are not solved once and then finished, but have to be gently reconfirmed for as long as the relationship continues. A quieter, more sustained mystery involved a young girl who arrived in Gotham with almost no ability to speak, no formal education, and an unnervingly precise understanding of body language and physical combat that suggested a level of training no ordinary childhood could account for. Cassandra Cain communicated almost entirely through movement and expression, and it took the Bat family a considerable amount of time and a great deal of patience to piece together what had happened to her before she ever arrived in Gotham. The eventual answer was as unsettling as anything else in this collection. Cassandra had been raised from infancy by her parents, both trained assassins, specifically to read physical movement instead of language, on the theory that a child taught to understand bodies rather than words would become an unmatched combatant, unclouded by hesitation or empathy. She had been used as a child to carry out an assassination before ever fleeing that life entirely, arriving in Gotham with a skill set that made her one of the most physically capable people Batman had ever encountered, and an emotional world that had been almost completely denied the ordinary tools most people rely on to process it. The mystery in this case was never really about identifying a threat. It was about understanding a person whose entire way of experiencing the world had been deliberately engineered to be unlike anyone else's, and about the slow, deliberate work the Bat family put into helping her recover a language, both spoken and emotional, that had been taken from her before she was old enough to remember having it. It remains one of the more quietly remarkable investigations in Batman's history, precisely because its resolution had nothing to do with catching anyone and everything to do with patience. Mysteries within the Bat family were rarely about who had committed a crime. More often, they were about how well anyone can truly know the people closest to them, a question that Gotham's most famous criminal would eventually turn into an entire, unsettling career of his own. Part 6. The Joker's Strangest Mysteries. Of all the unresolved questions in Batman's long career, the one he has made the least progress on, by his own admission, is the simplest sounding. Who was the Joker before he became the Joker? Various accounts exist. In one version, he was a failed comedian, drowning in debt, who agreed to guide two criminals through the chemical plant where he had once worked, only for the operation to go wrong and to send him falling into a vat of chemical waste while fleeing Batman himself, emerging with bleached skin, green hair, and a mind that had come loose from whatever it had been before. In another version, some of those same details shift. The comedian's failures more or less severe, his family's circumstances different, his personality before the accident somewhat kinder or somewhat crueler, depending on who is telling the story. The Joker himself has never resolved the discrepancy, and on at least one occasion, confronted directly about which version was true, he responded that if he was forced to have a past, he preferred it to be multiple choice. Batman has investigated the Joker's origins more than once, out of the same instinct that drives him to close every other unsolved file in Gotham, and has never been able to confirm a single, verified account of who the man was before the accident that made him. Whether this is because the records were destroyed, because the Joker has deliberately obscured them, or because the person he was before is simply no longer accessible even to him, remains an open question, and one of the very few in Batman's career that resists the kind of patient, evidence-based resolution that works on almost every other case. A recurring, lower-grade mystery threaded through many of Batman's encounters with the Joker involved a specialized toxin, sometimes released as a gas, and sometimes delivered by more direct means, that left its victims frozen in a rictus grin, dead or dying with an expression of hysterical laughter, locked onto their faces regardless of what they had actually been feeling in their final moments. Because the toxin's exact chemical composition shifted slightly from batch to batch, seemingly by deliberate design, Batman and Gotham's toxicologists were forced to treat nearly every fresh outbreak as a partially new problem, reverse engineering an antidote under time pressure, rather than relying on a single, permanent cure. The mystery in these cases was rarely about who was responsible, since the method made the Joker's involvement obvious almost immediately. It was about the frustrating, recurring puzzle of the antidote itself, a chemical solution that had to be rebuilt, tested, and refined nearly every time the toxin reappeared, because the Joker seemed to take a particular, petty satisfaction in altering his own formula just enough to render Batman's previous countermeasures useless. It became one of the more exhausting, unglamorous forms of detective work in Batman's career, less about a single flash of insight, and more about the grinding, repetitive labor of staying one step ahead of an enemy who treated even his own chemistry as another opportunity to be unpredictable. A different kind of question surrounded Harleen Quinzel, the psychiatrist assigned to treat the Joker during one of his stays at Arkham Asylum, whose sessions with him gradually inverted into something closer to devotion than professional distance, until she abandoned her career entirely to become his accomplice, calling herself Harley Quinn. For a long stretch of time, Batman found the question of how to treat her legally and morally almost as difficult as any of the actual crimes she participated in. Was she a victim of a uniquely skilled manipulator, groomed and exploited by someone who specialized in exactly that kind of psychological unraveling? Or had she made a series of increasingly informed, willing choices that deserved to be judged on their own terms regardless of how she arrived at them? The Joker's treatment of her, oscillating between affection and open cruelty, made the question harder rather than easier to settle, since neither extreme fully supported one interpretation over the other. Batman's own approach shifted over the years as Harley's own path shifted, eventually diverging from the Joker entirely and building an identity and set of loyalties independent of him, a development that answered, at least partially, a question that had genuinely divided Gotham's law enforcement for a long time. That a person shaped by manipulation is not therefore permanently defined by it, and that the honest answer to the question of what Harley Quinn actually was probably changed, meaningfully, more than once over the course of her own story. A smaller, stranger case arrived the night the Joker committed what appeared to be a flawless robbery, one that should have left him comfortably wealthy and entirely unidentified, only to walk into a Gotham police station a few hours later and confess to it in complete, unprompted detail. Gordon initially suspected some kind of trap, and Batman, arriving to observe the confession, found himself investigating not a crime but a motive, trying to understand why a man who had gotten away clean would choose to give himself up for nothing. The eventual answer revealed that the robbery itself had never been the actual goal. What the Joker wanted was a specific, short-term stay inside Arkham Asylum, close to a particular fellow inmate he needed access to for reasons connected to an entirely separate scheme already in motion elsewhere in the city. The confession, and the crime that prompted it, existed purely to secure that access through the most convenient door available. It was, in its own way, one of the purer examples of how the Joker's apparent unpredictability so often conceals a very deliberate, if deeply strange, internal logic, one that rarely resembles the logic anyone investigating him expects to find. A far more deliberately engineered mystery arrived decades later, when the Joker orchestrated an elaborate campaign against the entire extended Bat family built around a single grotesque prop. His own face, removed and worn as a mask, with his real face left uncovered and altered beneath it. The stated purpose of the scheme was to strip away what the Joker viewed as the pretense in Batman's relationships with the people around him, forcing a series of confrontations meant to convince each member of the Bat family that their closeness to Batman made them weaker rather than stronger. The investigation into the Joker's intentions during that period was less about identifying a suspect, since his involvement was obvious from the start, and more about understanding the specific psychological architecture of what he was trying to accomplish, city block by city block, relationship by relationship, as though the entire crime were a single, extended argument rather than a string of separate incidents. What Batman eventually determined, piecing together the Joker's individual confrontations with Nightwing, Batgirl, Red Robin, and Damian Wayne, was that the true target of the scheme was never any one of them, but the relationships themselves, and the idea that Batman had, in the Joker's estimation, grown dangerously reliant on people he could lose. It remains one of the clearest examples of a case where solving the mystery meant understanding not what the Joker had done, but what he believed about Batman, correctly or not, deeply enough to build an entire operation around proving it. More than once over the years, Gotham has been asked to believe that the Joker was finally, genuinely dead, and more than once, Batman has been the one left to quietly determine whether that belief was actually justified. On at least one occasion, a body matching the Joker's description was recovered under circumstances that satisfied the police, the coroner, and most of Gotham's press entirely, only for evidence to surface afterwards suggesting the death had been staged, the body substituted, and the entire event orchestrated as an elaborate piece of theater rather than an actual ending. What made these cases genuinely difficult, beyond the obvious problem of confirming a death convincingly enough to satisfy a man who had every incentive and every resource to fake one, was the psychological toll of investigating a death Batman was not entirely sure he was allowed to feel relief about. Treating every reported Joker death as a potential deception, rather than as a resolution, became its own quiet burden, a permanent asterisk attached to any news of his enemy's apparent end. Batman has learned, through repetition, to withhold judgment on the subject entirely, treating each claimed death as an open case rather than a closed one until the evidence is overwhelming. And even then, allowing for the possibility that overwhelming evidence, where the Joker is concerned, might still not be enough. Not every mystery in Gotham, however, could be traced back to human motive at all, however twisted. Some of Batman's strangest nights involved threats that seemed, at least for a while, to come from somewhere else entirely. Part 7. The Supernatural Side of Batman. Batman has always approached the supernatural the way he approaches everything else, as a problem with a mechanism, even when the mechanism initially resists explanation. Few cases tested that instinct as thoroughly as his long, complicated history with Kirk Langstrom, a scientist whose research into bat physiology, intended to help people with hearing impairments, went catastrophically wrong. Langstrom's early experiments involved extracting enzymes from bats in an attempt to develop a serum that might grant humans some of their sensory abilities. When he tested an early version of the serum on himself, rather than granting him controlled enhancement, it triggered a violent, uncontrollable transformation into a massive, bat-like creature, larger and more feral than any bat should be, with something of Langstrom's mind still trapped somewhere inside it. Gotham initially reported the resulting attacks as an unexplainable monster loose in the city, the kind of story that could easily have been dismissed as urban legend if the injuries left behind hadn't been so undeniably real. Batman's investigation into the creature quickly identified the scientific cause behind what looked, on the surface, like something out of folklore, tracing the attacks back to Langstrom's laboratory and uncovering the notes documenting his own transformation. The genuinely difficult part of the case, however, was not identifying the cause. It was recognizing that the creature terrorizing Gotham was not a monster in any meaningful moral sense, but a man, trapped inside a transformation he had not fully intended, and that the correct response was not simply to stop him, but to find a way to reverse what had happened to him. Langstrom's condition would recur throughout his life, in cycles of relapse and partial recovery, and Batman's relationship with him remained one of quiet, ongoing concern, rather than simple antagonism. A rare case in Gotham where the file was never truly closed because the person at the center of it never fully escaped his own condition. His wife, Francine, complicated the case further after she began using a version of the same serum herself, in the hope of finding a cure, by studying its effects from the inside, rather than merely treating her husband from without. For a period of time, Gotham had not one but two man-bat creatures moving through its skies, and Batman's investigation had to account for both independently, tracking two overlapping patterns of erratic, half-remembered behavior rather than one, while trying to keep the Langstroms' young daughter shielded from a household that had, through good intentions and bad luck in equal measure, become considerably more dangerous than either parent had intended. Batman never did find a permanent cure to offer them, only a long, ongoing arrangement of monitoring and occasional intervention. One of the few cases in his career defined less by resolution than by endurance. Few of Gotham's recurring threats raised a stranger, more persistent question than Solomon Grundy, a hulking, undead creature that rose repeatedly from the same stretch of swamp on Gotham's outskirts, each time claiming, in slow, halting speech, to be a man named Cyrus Gold who had died there decades earlier. Every time Batman or one of his allies managed to defeat Grundy decisively enough that his destruction seemed permanent, he eventually reappeared again, sometimes years later, rising from the same swamp with the same basic story, and disturbingly, very little memory of what had happened to him the previous time. What Batman was never able to fully resolve, across multiple encounters over many years, was whether each returning Grundy represented a genuine continuation of the same consciousness, somehow persisting through repeated destruction, or whether the swamp itself was generating an entirely new entity each time, coincidentally inheriting the same memories, the same name, and the same slow, mournful confusion about his own condition. Both explanations accounted for the observed facts about equally well, and no examination Batman arranged, medical or otherwise, ever definitively favored one over the other. Grundy remained, case after case, less a mystery to be solved and more a mystery to be managed, contained again and again without ever being genuinely understood. On at least one occasion, Batman's investigation into a series of unexplained deaths tied to an old occult ritual led him to seek out help from a source he would ordinarily have approached with total skepticism. A demon named Etrigan, magically bound to the body of a scholar named Jason Blood, called forth by an ancient incantation whenever the situation demanded power well beyond ordinary human limits. The case itself involved a Gotham cult attempting to complete a ritual that, according to the fragments of text Batman had recovered, was intended to summon something considerably worse than any human criminal he had faced before. Batman's usual methods, careful observation and physical evidence, were of limited use against a threat rooted in genuine mystical practice, and he found himself, uncomfortably, relying on Etrigan's specialized knowledge of the occult to understand what the cult was actually trying to accomplish and how to stop it before the ritual completed. Working alongside Etrigan was never entirely comfortable. The demon's priorities did not always align with Batman's own, and his methods tended toward considerably more destruction than Batman would have chosen on his own. But the case was resolved, the ritual interrupted before completion, and Batman came away from it with a somewhat wider, if still carefully guarded, willingness to accept that some of Gotham's threats required tools outside his usual detective's kit entirely. An older, stranger case from earlier in Batman's career involved a supposed cult leader operating out of an abandoned monastery on the outskirts of Gotham, a man calling himself the Monk, around whom rumors of genuine supernatural power had begun to circulate among the small number of people who had encountered him and survived. Batman approached the case with his usual skepticism, expecting to find, underneath the rumors, an ordinary criminal exploiting superstition for leverage over a frightened community. What he found instead was more difficult to categorize cleanly. The monk displayed abilities that resisted straightforward explanation, an unnatural resistance to injury, an ability to influence the minds of those around him, and habits that aligned unsettlingly well with old folklore about creatures that did not age and did not die by ordinary means. Batman never fully resolved, even to his own satisfaction, whether the monk represented something genuinely outside the boundaries of the natural world, or an unusually gifted, unusually deranged human being who had spent decades cultivating the appearance of something worse. The case ended with the threat contained, but the underlying question, one of the very few Batman has ever left without a firm conclusion, remained something he preferred simply not to revisit too closely. One of the strangest partnerships in Batman's career began the night he found himself, quite literally, guided by a ghost. Boston Brand had been a circus acrobat, performing under the name Deadman, before he was murdered mid-performance by an assassin he never got a clear look at. Rather than passing on entirely, Brand found himself bound to the world as a spirit, invisible to almost everyone, capable of temporarily possessing the bodies of the living, and driven by a single unresolved obsession: identifying the man who had killed him. When Brand's path crossed with Batman's, the resulting investigation unfolded unlike almost any other case in this collection, because one of the two investigators involved had no physical body of his own to contribute, and had to rely instead on possessing bystanders, witnesses, and occasionally Batman himself in order to interact with the physical evidence at all. Batman, characteristically skeptical of anything presenting itself as supernatural, spent a considerable portion of the case testing whether Brand's ghostly claims held up against verifiable physical fact, rather than simply accepting them because they were dramatic. They held up. The killer, once identified, turned out to be connected to a wider criminal organization with its own reasons for wanting Brand dead, and the case closed with a resolution that satisfied both investigators, though only one of them was able to walk away from it afterward in any conventional sense. What Batman took from the experience was not a newfound belief in ghosts specifically, but a somewhat expanded willingness to treat evidence as evidence regardless of how strange its source, a principle that would serve him well in several of Gotham's later, equally unusual cases. Cases like these reminded Batman that Gotham's mysteries did not always resolve into a clean, satisfying answer, a lesson that would matter a great deal during some of the darkest investigations of his career. Part 8. Batman's Darkest Investigations. There is a particular kind of case that is frightening not because of what the criminal does, but because of how deeply they manage to reach into the mind of the person investigating them. And few cases in Batman's history reached as deep, or as quietly, as the long campaign waged against him by a man calling himself Dr. Simon Hurt. The case did not begin as an obvious attack. It began with small, disorienting inconsistencies in Batman's own memory and behavior, moments where he seemed to lose time, or acted in ways that did not match his own judgment, without any clear external cause. Bruce Wayne, normally the most self-aware person in any room, found himself unable to fully trust his own recent history, discovering evidence of decisions he did not remember making and conversations he did not remember having. For a detective whose entire identity rested on the reliability of his own observation, the sensation of being unable to trust his own mind was, by his own account afterward, more disturbing than any physical threat he had faced. The investigation revealed slowly that Hurt had spent years infiltrating the people and institutions closest to Bruce Wayne, planting false memories, manipulating his psychological conditioning through methods reaching back to Bruce's own early training, and orchestrating a citywide criminal alliance specifically designed to break Batman down piece by piece, rather than defeat him in a single confrontation. Hurt's own identity remained, and still remains, deliberately unresolved. He has implied at various points that he is Bruce Wayne's own ancestor, a man who should be long dead, or something considerably older and stranger than either explanation accounts for, and Batman was never able to fully confirm which claim, if any, was true. What ultimately allowed Batman to survive the case was not a single deduction, but a contingency he had built into his own mind years earlier, a secondary identity called Zur-En-Air, developed specifically as a fail-safe against the possibility that his primary personality might one day be compromised beyond his ability to reason his way out normally. Discovering that he had, in effect, built a version of himself capable of operating even when Bruce Wayne's own judgment failed was one of the most unsettling realizations of Batman's career, a reminder that the person he trusted most completely, himself, had once judged it necessary to prepare for the possibility of his own breakdown. The case also forced Batman to reckon with just how long Hurt's manipulation had actually been running beneath the surface of his life. with evidence eventually suggesting that certain seemingly unrelated setbacks and misfortunes stretching back years had, in fact, been quietly engineered as part of the same extended campaign. Untangling which of his own past struggles had been genuine and which had been deliberately manufactured by Hurt became its own smaller, grimmer investigation within the larger one. And Batman has admitted since that he has never been entirely confident he identified every instance of Hurt's interference, only the ones significant enough to leave a traceable mark. A very different kind of darkness surrounded Gotham roughly a decade earlier, when a self-proclaimed prophet named Deacon Blackfire began drawing followers from the city's homeless population, promising them protection and purpose in exchange for absolute loyalty. What began as an investigation into a possible cult, the kind of case Batman had handled before, deepened considerably when Blackfire's followers began committing violent acts with a devotion that suggested something closer to genuine brainwashing than simple persuasion. Batman's own capture and psychological conditioning during this investigation, subjected to methods that briefly turned him into an instrument of Blackfire's will, remains one of the few periods in his career where he was forced to be rescued rather than doing the rescuing, an experience that left him deeply cautious, for years afterward, about how easily even a disciplined mind could be unmade under the right kind of pressure. The eventual resolution of the case involved uncovering Blackfire's own claims of supernatural power as an extension of genuine, cultivated psychological manipulation, rather than anything outside the natural world. Though Batman, characteristically, remained more interested afterward in how thoroughly Blackfire had managed to compromise him than in exactly how the man had done it. Among the darkest individual cases Batman ever investigated involved a surgeon calling himself Professor Pig, whose crimes centered on a horrifying process he referred to as making dolls, using crude surgical alteration and psychological conditioning to strip victims of their original identities and personalities entirely, replacing them with docile, mask-wearing followers who no longer remembered who they had been before. The investigation was slow and deeply unpleasant, requiring Batman to identify victims who, by the time they were found, could no longer reliably describe their own abduction or even confirm their own original names without extensive, careful psychiatric work to help recover what Pig's process had buried. Rather than a single dramatic confrontation, the case unfolded as an extended, grim process of both pursuit and recovery, tracking Pig's operation while simultaneously working to undo, as much as possible, the damage already done to the people he had already taken. It stands among the cases Batman discusses least willingly afterward, not because the culprit was difficult to identify, but because so much of what Pig had already done to his victims proved impossible to fully reverse, regardless of how quickly the investigation itself concluded. One of the darkest periods in Gotham's history began not with a single criminal but with a natural disaster, when a massive earthquake devastated the city and the federal government, judging the damage too extensive and too costly to repair, formally cut Gotham off from the rest of the country, declaring it a no-man's land and withdrawing nearly all outside support. What followed was less a single case than an extended, grinding investigation into how a city survives when its own government has effectively abandoned it, with different sections of Gotham falling under the control of whichever criminal organization proved strong enough to hold territory. Batman himself disappeared for a portion of this period, an absence that was never fully, satisfyingly explained even to those closest to him, and Gotham's residents were left to wonder, in the vacuum, whether he had died in the earthquake abandoned the city along with the government, or simply retreated to reassess a situation too large for any one person to fix through ordinary methods. His eventual return, and the slow, methodical work of reclaiming territory block by block with the help of Gordon's remaining police force, remains one of the longest, least conventional investigations of his career, since the mystery being solved was never really who was responsible for a single crime, but the far larger, more exhausting question of how order gets rebuilt at all once it has been allowed to collapse completely. One of the more uncomfortable investigations early in Batman's career involved a masked vigilante calling himself the Reaper, whose methods were brutal enough that several of Gotham's criminals turned up dead rather than simply defeated, and whose presence forced Batman to examine a version of vigilantism he had deliberately chosen not to become. The Reaper, it turned out, had once been a resistance fighter in Europe decades earlier, a man whose wartime experience had trained him to treat lethal force as simply another tool, and who had never fully set that framework aside upon returning to ordinary life. Watching Gotham's corruption fester in his old age had drawn him back into a version of the same role, this time without any of the restraint Batman had built into his own methods from the very beginning. The investigation was less about identifying the Reaper, whose identity became clear relatively early, and more about the deeper discomfort of the case. Recognizing how closely the Reaper's origin mirrored Batman's own, a personal tragedy transformed into a lifelong mission, and confronting the fact that the difference between the two of them rested entirely on a line Batman had chosen to draw for himself, rather than one imposed on him from outside. Stopping the Reaper required Batman to defend that line directly, in a confrontation that felt, by his own later account, considerably more personal than most of the physical fights he had been in before or since. Long before Batman ever patrolled Gotham, the very asylum that would later house so many of his enemies had its own dark, largely forgotten origin, one Batman uncovered only by digging through records the institution itself had quietly buried. Amadeus Arkham, the psychiatrist who founded Arkham Asylum, had built the institution partly out of genuine compassion, and partly, it turned out of a personal descent into the same kind of madness he had originally hoped to treat. Arkham's own case notes, discovered decades later, revealed a man who had begun his career with sincere, careful intentions, only to be worn down by proximity to his most disturbed patients, culminating in a mental collapse that led him to murder one of them personally before losing his own grip on reality entirely. The asylum he founded to help people like his patients had, by the end of his life, quietly become one more example of exactly the kind of untreated deterioration it was meant to prevent. Investigating Arkham's history was less about solving an active crime and more about understanding the institution Batman had, by necessity, come to rely on so heavily over the years, and recognizing that the building's unsettling reputation had not come from nowhere. It left Batman with a more complicated view of Arkham Asylum than he had held before, aware that the walls meant to contain Gotham's worst impulses had, at least once, failed to contain them in the person who built the place to begin with. Not every dark case in Gotham involved brainwashing or manipulation on this scale, however. Some of the strangest ones simply required Batman to look further back into Gotham's history than he was used to looking. Part 9. The strangest cases in Batman's history. Early in his career, after his first handful of encounters with cases that resisted easy explanation, Batman began keeping a private, separate file for incidents that did not fit comfortably into ordinary detective work. Cases that brushed against the supernatural, the scientifically impossible, or simply the deeply strange, without ever fully confirming or disproving what he had actually witnessed. He came to refer to it, privately, as his black casebook, a record of unresolved oddities he revisited periodically rather than filing away and forgetting. Some of what filled its pages were cases that would later resolve into perfectly rational explanations, once Batman had the right piece of information, the kind of thing a follow-up investigation years afterward could close out with satisfaction. Others never resolved at all, and remained exactly where he had first recorded them, unexplained and unresolved regardless of how many times he returned to reread his own old notes with fresh eyes. Maintaining that file was, in its own quiet way, an admission that even Gotham's most relentless detective had learned to accept that not every mystery bends to patience and evidence on a convenient schedule, and that the honest thing to do with a case like that was not to force a tidy conclusion, but to write down exactly what he knew and did not know, and leave it open for whenever more information arrived. Even the ground beneath Wayne Manor turned out to hold more history than Batman had assumed for most of his life. During the same period that revealed the Court of Owl's existence, Batman discovered chambers deep beneath the Batcave that predated his own use of the space by well over a century, evidence that earlier generations of the Wayne family had known about, and in some cases actively used, portions of the cave system for their own purposes long before Bruce Wayne ever considered it a secret exclusively his own. Tracing exactly what earlier Waynes had done down there, and why the knowledge had never been passed down to him directly, became its own small, unsettling investigation into his own family history, one that complicated the tidy assumption he had always carried that the Batcave was something he alone had discovered and made meaningful. It remained one of the clearer reminders, among all of Gotham's mysteries, that even the foundation Batman quite literally built his life on top of still had rooms he had never fully explored. Gotham's oldest families have always guarded their history carefully, and Batman spent years assuming that history, however unpleasant, was at least fully accounted for. That assumption collapsed when he discovered the existence of the Court of Owls, a secret society of Gotham's wealthiest citizens that had, according to evidence Batman eventually uncovered, been quietly shaping the city's history for centuries, using assassins known as Talons to remove anyone who threatened their influence. Batman had grown up hearing about the Court of Owls as a children's rhyme, a piece of local folklore meant to frighten misbehaving kids into staying indoors after dark, and had never seriously entertained the idea that the rhyme described something real. The case began when a Talon assassin, preserved and reactivated after what appeared to be centuries of dormancy, was sent to kill Bruce Wayne directly, forcing Batman to reconsider a piece of Gotham history he had dismissed his entire life as harmless legend. The deeper Batman investigated, the more the court's fingerprints appeared throughout Gotham's past, embedded in decisions and disappearances that had shaped the city for generations without ever being publicly connected to a single, coherent cause. Talons themselves, Batman eventually learned, were sustained across decades through their own version of the restorative treatments Ra's al Ghul relied on, allowing individual assassins trained centuries earlier to be reactivated, largely unaged, whenever the court required them, which meant that several of Gotham's oldest unsolved disappearances and killings, cases Batman had assumed belonged to entirely separate, unconnected eras of the city's history, turned out to share a single, patient hand behind them all along. It remains one of the most disorienting cases of Batman's career specifically, because it was not really about solving a single crime, but about realizing how much of Gotham's supposedly settled history had never actually been examined closely enough. hidden in plain sight behind a rhyme everyone in the city already knew by heart and had simply never taken seriously. A stranger, more isolated case from later in Batman's career involved his own mind rather than the city around him. During a period when a combination of extreme physical exhaustion, sensory deprivation, and calculated psychological pressure from an enemy left him uncertain, for several disorienting days, which version of his own memories could actually be trusted. Rather than a straightforward physical mystery, this case unfolded almost entirely inside Batman's own perception, forcing him to apply his investigative method to himself, questioning his own recollections with the same rigor he would apply to an unreliable witness, cross-referencing physical evidence against what his memory insisted had happened, and slowly reconstructing an accurate timeline of his own recent life. It stands as one of the strangest entries in his history, precisely because the detective and the mystery in this case were the exact same person, and because the case was ultimately solved not through any external clue, but through Batman's stubborn refusal to trust his own certainty simply because it felt certain. Among the strangest cases Batman has ever confronted was the arrival of a version of himself from an entirely different, considerably darker reality, one where he had lost a very different, very personal battle against the Joker years earlier, and had chosen, in the aftermath, to poison his enemy in a way that transferred something of the Joker's own mind into his own. The result was a version of Batman who retained all of his original detective skill and resources, filtered now through a personality that had become as calculating and remorseless as the villain he had once fought. This other Batman, calling himself the Batman who laughs, crossed over into Gotham's own reality during a period when the barriers between different versions of Batman's world had become dangerously thin. Investigating him required Batman to work from an unusually disorienting position, studying someone who used his own exact methods, his own detective's patience, and his own intimate understanding of Gotham's geography, but who applied all of it toward goals Batman found genuinely horrifying. It became less a matter of predicting an unfamiliar opponent's next move and more a matter of recognizing, uncomfortably, that every strategy this other Batman used was one Batman himself might just as easily have devised under sufficiently different circumstances. The case ended with the threat contained and the barrier between realities restored, but it left Batman with a specific, lingering discomfort, unlike almost any other entry in this collection. The knowledge that somewhere, under conditions only slightly different from his own, a version of himself existed who had made exactly the wrong choice at exactly the moment that mattered most. He kept a private note about the encounter afterward, not in his general case files, but in the older, stranger record he had maintained since the earliest days of his career, alongside Solomon Grundy, the monk, and the handful of other cases that had never fully resolved into something he could file away with confidence. It was, in its own way, an admission that some threats are worth remembering less for what they did than for what they revealed about how narrow the margin can be between the detective he had become and the considerably darker outcomes he had, through some combination of discipline and simple good fortune, managed to avoid. Perhaps the single strangest entry in Batman's entire history involves a period during which he was, by every available account, simply gone, following a catastrophic confrontation with Darkseid, the tyrannical ruler of a distant world, who struck Batman down with a weapon capable of erasing a person from time itself, rather than simply killing them. Gotham mourned him as dead, and for a while, the evidence supported that conclusion entirely. What actually happened, pieced together only much later, was considerably stranger than a straightforward death. Batman had been thrown backward through his own timeline, waking briefly in different periods of Gotham's past, from its earliest prehistoric settlement to the height of its colonial founding, before eventually finding his way back to the present. Reconstructing what had actually happened to him required Batman, once he returned, to treat his own recent history as an active case, gathering fragments of memory and physical evidence from a period that most of Gotham had already filed away as simply the story of how he died. It remains one of the deepest, strangest cases in his history precisely because it defies the ordinary boundaries of an investigation. There was no criminal to interrogate and no crime scene to examine in any conventional sense, only a timeline that had to be reconstructed piece by piece, by a detective investigating his own disappearance from a version of the world that had already, understandably, decided he was gone for good. Cases like these left Batman with the uncomfortable understanding that some of Gotham's deepest mysteries were not hidden from him by criminals at all. Some of them had simply never been asked about, until something forced the question into the open, a category of mystery that, by its nature, does not always come with a satisfying resolution. Part 10. Mysteries Batman Never Fully Solved. Not every file in Batman's collection has a closing page, and it is worth spending some time, before the night is through, on the ones that never quite got one. The identity and the true nature of Dr. Simon Hurt remains among the most persistent of these. Even after the man's schemes were uncovered and stopped, the question of who he actually was, an ancestor of the Wayne family somehow still alive after more than a century, an elaborate hoax constructed by a criminal organization to demoralize Batman psychologically, or something closer to the older, stranger claims Hurt himself occasionally made about his own nature, was never conclusively settled. Batman has, at various points, favored different explanations depending on the evidence in front of him at the time, and has quietly acknowledged that he may simply never know for certain which one, if any, is true. It remains filed in his own private accounting of Gotham's history, under cases resolved in practice but not in principle. Whether the Joker has, at some point, genuinely worked out that Batman is Bruce Wayne remains one of the more persistently debated open questions in Batman's own private accounting of his oldest rivalry. Certain encounters over the years have included remarks from the Joker that seem to hint at knowledge he should not have had, delivered with just enough ambiguity that they could equally have been an educated guess, a bluff intended to unsettle, or genuine insight he chose not to act on for reasons entirely his own. Other encounters have suggested the opposite, a Joker who seemed genuinely uncertain, or simply uninterested in an answer he might already privately consider beside the point. Batman has generally concluded that the question may not have a single, stable answer at all, since the Joker's relationship with consistency, let alone the truth, has never been reliable in the way an ordinary investigation would require. He has learned, largely out of necessity, to operate as though the Joker might already know everything, without ever receiving confirmation one way or the other, which leaves this particular file permanently open, less because the evidence is insufficient and more because the person at the center of it has no interest in ever letting it close. The full extent of the Court of Owl's remaining influence over Gotham belongs on this same list. Batman dismantled a significant portion of their operation once their existence was confirmed, but a secret society patient enough to operate undetected for centuries is not the kind of organization that reveals the entirety of its structure in a single confrontation. Batman has continued in the years since to find small, scattered indications that some portion of the court's network may still be intact, hidden more carefully than before, and he has never been able to determine with confidence whether what remains is a genuine, ongoing threat or simply the last, harmless echoes of something he has already effectively ended. It stays filed, deliberately, under cases he continues to check on periodically rather than ones he considers closed. The Joker's true past belongs in this same category, and probably always will. Batman has, over the years, gathered enough fragments to sketch a plausible outline of who the man may have been, but never enough to confirm a single, verified account, and the Joker himself has shown no interest in ever settling the matter. Some detectives might find this kind of permanent uncertainty intolerable. Batman has come, reluctantly, to accept it as one of the very few constants in his relationship with his oldest enemy, a mystery that persists not because it has not been investigated thoroughly enough, but because the person at its center has made it his life's work to ensure it never can be. Even the full truth behind the Holiday murders, the case that shaped Harvey Dent's final year as district attorney before his transformation into Two-Face, has never been resolved with complete certainty in Batman's own private accounting, despite the passage of many years and several partial confirmations gathered since. Some questions, Batman has come to understand, do not stay solved simply because enough time has passed. They stay open, quietly, in the part of his mind that keeps track of everything Gotham has never fully explained to him. A final, quieter mystery belongs to Ra's al Ghul, the leader of a centuries-old organization known as the League of Assassins, whose survival across an extraordinary length of time has never been fully explained even to Batman's satisfaction. Ra's has relied for generations on the restorative properties of the Lazarus Pits, mysterious, chemically active springs capable of healing grievous injury and extending life well beyond its natural limits. What those same pits have done to his mind over so many repeated exposures remains considerably less clear. Ra's al Ghul is, by every outward measure, brilliant, patient, and disturbingly rational in his own worldview, convinced that Gotham, and the wider world along with it, would benefit from a kind of ruthless ecological correction only he is willing to carry out. Whether centuries of Lazarus Pit exposure have preserved his mind in a genuinely stable state, or whether what Batman is actually dealing with is a once reasonable man's judgment slowly, invisibly eroded across a lifespan no human mind evolved to sustain, has never been conclusively determined by Batman or by anyone else who has studied him closely. Ra's himself insists he has never been more clear-headed. Batman has learned not to take that claim entirely at face value, and not to fully dismiss it either, leaving one more file in Gotham's long history that seems destined to stay open indefinitely. Final chapter: The Detective in the Dark. If you strip away the cape, the gadgets, and the decades of villains with their own elaborate mythologies, what remains at the center of every case in this collection is something considerably simpler than any of it. A man who refuses to stop looking, even when looking becomes uncomfortable, even when the answer might implicate someone he trusted, and even when, as with the Joker's origin or Dr. Hurt's true nature, there may never be an answer waiting at the end of the search at all. It would have been easier, in almost every one of these cases, for Batman to accept the first explanation that presented itself. Hugo Strange's impersonation might have gone unnoticed for far longer if Batman had simply trusted the people closest to him to notice something was wrong on their own. The Riddler's false reform might have been accepted at face value by a city eager for one fewer criminal to worry about. Arnold Wesker's condition might have been dismissed as an act, convenient and easy to file away, rather than investigated seriously enough to raise genuinely difficult questions about where a performance ends and a person begins. Batman rarely takes the easier path, not because he enjoys difficulty for its own sake, but because he has learned, case after case, that the easier explanation is disproportionately often the wrong one, and that Gotham's worst outcomes tend to follow from mysteries that were closed too quickly rather than ones that were investigated too thoroughly. It is a discipline that costs him something every time he practices it. Certainty is comforting, and Batman has spent a career denying himself that comfort in favor of something less immediately satisfying but considerably more reliable. The habit of continuing to ask questions after everyone else has already decided they know the answer. This is, in the end, the quality that ties every case in this collection together. From a locked room poisoning in his very first recorded investigation to a mystery he still has not fully closed involving his own oldest enemy. Batman's real weapon has never been his strength, his wealth, or even his intelligence in isolation. It has been his willingness to sit with an unsolved problem for as long as it takes, to treat a confession with suspicion and a familiar face with scrutiny, and to accept that some nights, the most honest thing a detective can do is admit that the file stays open. It is worth remembering, too, that Batman rarely does any of this alone, even when the cases in this collection make it sound that way. Commissioner Gordon's willingness to trust evidence over easy assumptions, Alfred's quiet, persistent attentiveness, and the instincts of a growing family of partners who each learn to notice something Batman himself sometimes missed. All of it belongs in the same accounting. A detective's method is only as good as his willingness to actually use what the people around him bring to a case, and Batman's long record of closed files, and even his shorter, more honest list of open ones, reflects a partnership built over decades as much as it reflects any solitary brilliance. Gotham, for its part, has never run out of reasons to test that willingness. It likely never will. But as long as someone is still willing to look closely at the details everyone else overlooked, the city's mysteries, however strange, however old, however unresolved, will always eventually find someone paying attention. Ending. The fog is still sitting low over Gotham as this story closes, the way it usually is by this hour, and somewhere above the rooftops, the search continues quietly, the way it always does, whether anyone is watching or not. Not every question gets answered by morning. Some of them Batman has been carrying for years, turning them over occasionally in the stillness between cases, without any particular urgency to resolve them tonight. That, in its own way, is part of what makes him who he is. A city like Gotham does not reward impatience, and a detective who needed every mystery solved immediately would not have lasted very long in a place like this. For now, the cases can rest. The Riddler is somewhere else's problem tonight. The Court of Owls has been quiet for a while. Even Gotham's oldest, least answerable questions, the ones that may never fully close, are simply waiting, the way they always are, for whenever the city decides to raise them again. Somewhere in that long list of cases, closed and unclosed alike, there is probably one that stayed with you a little longer than the others. The way a particular room in a house you have only visited once sometimes stays with you longer than the whole rest of the visit. That is fine. Gotham has never asked anyone to remember all of it at once. It only asks, the way it has asked Batman for a very long time now, that someone keep paying attention, a little at a time, for as long as it takes. The rest of the city's questions will still be there tomorrow, filed away exactly where they were left, waiting patiently for whenever anyone is ready to look at them again. Tonight, though, there is nothing left to solve. If you are still listening, You have made it through a great many strange nights in Gotham without ever having to leave your own bed, which is, in the end, exactly how a night like this one is supposed to go. Good night, and thank you for spending the night in Gotham.